This relaxation story is called The Returning Viking and is written by me, Amanda Stockhouse. Before the story begins, I want you to make yourself as comfortable as possible in a way that suits you. Once you have found the right position, I want you to fill your lungs with air all the way to the top before you slowly breathe out and let your body relax. Now we are ready to start. The rain came pouring down towards the wild waves of the sea, while the wind furiously pulled at the big sails far above the men's heads. Without a doubt, the storm was now upon them. Far away in the distance, a thundering sound was heard. It was the sound of two goats called Tandgnisle and Tandglese, as they pulled their master Thor, the god of thunder, in his chariot over the sky. The sound grew in strength and then ended with a flashing light that only occurred when the great god of thunder swung his hammer Mjolnir. The light gleamed across the sky in the shape of an enraged snake, in search of a new victim to put its sharp teeth in. The weather had been far from pleasant on their journey across the sea, but they had had the gods on their side all the way, and the journey had so far gone better than they could even have dreamed of. A journey across the sea was always dangerous. If one had not pleased the gods with all the rituals that were needed before leaving, it could easily end with the whole crew standing in front the gates to Hel herself, the goddess of death. But they had sacrificed and performed the rituals that was needed for a successful journey, and so far it seemed to have worked. Everyone on board was still unharmed, and despite the weather, even in good spirits. On the horizon, the rolling landscapes that characterized their homeland appeared. Soon, their journey would be over. It was not long before they once again would lay safely by the shore. At the front of the big boat he stood, the man who had made this trip possible, the man who had dared when no one else dared, and who would now proudly return home as the hero he truly was. His reddish hair was half set in a knot on the back of his head, while the rest hung in ragged strands against his chest. His chin was blessed with a magnificent beard that had been braided to keep it in control during the numerous battles that had lined their journey through foreign land. Even though it didn't seem to worry him at all, the rain had begun to weigh it down, both the hair which grew on his head and that which grew on his chin. Heavy droplets had begun to accumulate at its ends, and now they were constantly dripping down towards the boat's rugged wooden floor in large splashes. However, this was hardly noticeable, as the sky seemed to have opened itself up like a horrific gap above them. It was as if the rain had never planned to end. All the water that their dry fields in the summer months had been longing for now seemed to come down over them all at once, just like a large and completely wild waterfall. Yet none of this seemed to bother the well-built man that steadily stood with both feet on the wooden deck. His blue eyes were firmly focused on the piece of land that for every second that passed came closer and closer. For the time being, there was nothing more important to him in this world than getting a glimpse of what hopefully awaited him on land. Another rumbling blow from Thor's hammer echoed out over the sea. This time, the sound was almost deafening, and for a short while it got the man to break his firm eye contact with shore. He took a quick glance at the dark sky above that now had lit up by the immense flash that spread there. The dangers of their expedition felt for a brief moment closer than ever, and he had to remind himself that the gods had so far been more than good to both him, the boat, and his men. Therefore, he did not fear Hell's kingdom of death, not even when the water seemed to counteract their journey over the sea in an attempt to prevent them from reaching land. Their entire journey had been a tribute to the gods themselves, and the man's heart was therefore quickly freed from worry. This could not end badly. By now, he was firmly convinced of that. Once again, he looked out towards land. Was it possible that he already could make out what was there by the seashore? Or was it just his imagination that made him think that he could see someone standing there? Had the villagers discovered their ship approaching? Had she seen them coming over the sea? Could she feel that he was getting closer? Could the loud beats of his heart be heard as he seemed to call out for her through the harsh winds? Was she really there, waiting for him as she had promised? He could barely glimpse the little flashes of light coming from their hometown. However, he had to admit to himself that the distance between him and the shore was far too great for him to really be able to see if someone was waiting for him there. The desire to see what his heart longed for most made him impatient. Could he make them go faster? He thought to himself. In that moment, time could not go quickly enough. The wind grabbed his dripping wet hair in an attempt to whip it in his face. But all the rainwater collected there had made it all too heavy. Instead, the wind only caused a barely noticeable movement in the reddish hair, even though it roared with all its power, so loud that the sound rang in the ears of all the men that had gathered on deck. The hair hardly moved. A greater impact, however, the wind had on the Viking's cheeks, which for every moment that passed got colder and colder as more and more of the wet drops that were there froze by the hands of the harsh weather. Slowly he raised his hand to wipe away the water that had gathered between his eyelashes. They had become more and more heavy because of the rain, and now the heavy droplets had started to cover his eyesight. Not for anything in the world was he going to miss the moment when he would finally see her standing there with her hand in the air, welcoming him back home. It was going to be a scene no raindrops ever could prevent him from experiencing. For so long he had waited and longed for the moment that soon would come, the moment when he would proudly get off the boat and finally prove that the elderly in the village had been wrong about him. He had succeeded in what they considered impossible, and now they would be stunned by his greatness. But above all else, he longed for the moment when he would be embraced by the warm arms that belonged to the woman who from this day on would always stand by his side. No longer was there anything that could keep them apart. No one could deny them the happiness of being together. The woman he longed for more than any other always seemed to shine like a star through the dark sky, brighter than anything else. Her eyes looked as if they carried all the joy of the world in them, and her arms were more welcoming than any others. If he had not had such huge respect for the goddess Freya, and possibly even a slight fear of hurting her ego, he would have called his beloved for the most attractive woman in the world, including both Midgard and Asgard. He was undoubtedly one of the bravest men in the village, but he was not really brave enough to dare challenge the goddess of love and passion. The gifts that he had brought with him, however, could just as easily have been for the goddess Freya herself. So extinguishably beautiful were they. He had brought several fabrics in all the colors of the rainbow, and they were all for her, the woman who owned his heart. He even had the most delicate ribbons and jewelry with him. But all of that seemed so boring in contrast with the two beautiful stone-clad brooches that he had taken with him from the foreign kingdoms across the sea. In his own head, he could see how the joy would spread in her eyes as she gently attached the two brooches to her dress. They both glowed beautifully in a deep blue tone, and he must admit to himself that he had been drawn to them at first sight, attracted by their beauty. Something about the brooches reminded him of a warm summer evening by the sea, and it was just that type of feeling that he wanted to bring her with this gift. Hopefully, she would carry them with joy in her heart as a sign of the strong love that existed between them. The waves beneath them diminished somewhat, while the distance between the boat and the shore gradually seemed to decrease. He glanced up towards the sky, and unless he wasn't mistaken, the rain seemed to have softened slightly, as if he had not been prepared for the sight that then met him when he once again looked at the shore. For a short while, he forgot to breathe. The great Viking that was coming home victorious from his long journey now had to remind himself to continue to fill his lungs with air. The smile that had struck him had been so overwhelming that if he didn't concentrate on his breath, he wouldn't be able to stand straight up. She had seen them coming through the dark, and despite the bad weather, she was now standing right there on the shore to greet him. Completely drenched by the rain and shaking because of the cold, she stood there with her hand slightly waving in the air as she welcomed him home. The contact between them was immediate, and it was as if the unpleasant fall weather around them had disappeared. It was a warm look in her eyes that had chased it away. At last, he was back at the place where he belonged. At last, he was home. The story that you just heard is called The Returning Viking. If you want me to continue telling stories like this one, please like the video or press the subscription button below. If you feel like being more involved in future relaxation stories, you're more than welcome to propose a subject for the next story in the comments. I wish you a continued peaceful day or night, and hope that I will see you soon again.